using lots of different resources during this series, but I wanted to let you know about two particular books that have been especially helpful to me. I'd love for you to know about them. One is a book called Making Sense of God by Tim Keller, one of my favorite books. And then the lesson that tonight, a lot of it's drawn from a book by Gavin Ortland called Why God Makes Sense in a World That Doesn't. No, I didn't rip off his title. He just ripped off my title before I came up with it. So, Why God Makes Sense. I want you to suppose that Hamlet went searching for Shakespeare. Now, you could say in one sense, that's going to be really hard. You know that Hamlet is a character in a story written by Shakespeare. So that could be really hard because Shakespeare is so far removed from Hamlet, in a different world, not in the story world, outside of it. On the other hand, you might say, actually, Shakespeare is so very close to Hamlet, Hamlet's never done anything but encounter Shakespeare. His whole world is authored by Shakespeare, and everything Hamlet does or sees or experiences is experiencing something of Shakespeare. Well, that's not a bad illustration for what it's like for us to try to reach out, get to know, and experience God. God, in one sense, is infinitely close. Augustine, who writes in the 4th century, says, God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. I love that line. Think about that. On the other hand, he seems so far above, far removed, high and holy, lofty. What do we do with that? The question of God, who he is, what he means, how I can know him, is truly unparalleled. In one sense, it is the most important and thrilling adventure of our lives. Think about anything else you'll do in your life, and it all pales in comparison to the search for God. Everything else is what will help me get through the next quarter or the next year or the next period or season of my life. Or you might even say, what will help me make the most sense of my whole life? But the search for God is to make sense of all that is, all that has been, all that will be. Second, it is the most fascinating puzzle that you'll ever think about. If there is no God, the very idea of God is the most brilliant idea in the history of the world. In the 1100s, a man named Anselm was writing a book, basically a book of prayers. This is daily devotion. And in his daily devotion, he's praying to God and he's recording his words, and he comes up with a definition of who God is that has been around and people have been using it for 1,000 years. And he says, God is that than which nothing greater could ever be thought of. Let me say that again. God is that than which nothing greater could ever be thought of. Now that seems simple, but all these philosophers began to attack it, but every time they tried, they didn't quite make it through. Someone said, oh no, I could think of something greater than God. And he'd say, oh really? If it really is greater than what I call God, then what you're thinking of is what we should call God. You see, someone says, wait a second, I could think of Shmad, and Shmad has one characteristic better than God. Well, then Shmad is what we mean by God. That than which nothing greater can be thought of, that's what we mean by God. And then he began to think about what that means, and he says, let's see. Let's just imagine the possibility that there exists something so great you can't think of anything better. Okay, let's imagine that. then that means that there's at least an imaginary world. There's at least one possible set of circumstances where God exists. Okay, I'll grant you that. Well, by definition, if he's greater than it can possibly, that you can't possibly think of anything greater than that, then if he exists in one possible world, he must exist in all possible worlds. You know why? Because if you can imagine a God who exists in one set of circumstances, but not two, I can think of something greater, and that's a God that exists in two. But if he exists in two, but not three, I can think of something greater, one that exists in three. So if you can imagine that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in one set of circumstances, then by definition, he must exist in all sets of circumstances. And then he says, you know what? The real world is one of those sets of circumstances. So I guess God must exist. There's people who love that one, and there's people who hate that one. That'll hurt your brain a little bit. It's called the ontological argument. And whether you like it or not, here's the point. For 1,000 years, people have been saying, there's just not a greater experiment than thinking about the idea of God. The third thing that is interesting is that the question of God humbles us. There's a story told of a Jewish rabbi who was trying to share the story of the existence of God with a young man who had made a great living in life and didn't feel a need for anything else, and was making all of his arguments why he didn't think there was a God. The rabbi just listened, and at the end of it, he started to walk out the door, and as he walked out the door, he just looked back and he said, yeah, but what if you're wrong? Great philosopher named Pascal, who came up with something called the wager. And if you go online, you just Google it, you'll find most people ridicule it, talk bad about it, say it's a really dumb argument. I don't feel that way at all. Here's the wager, then I'll tell you why I think it makes sense. The wager says this: if you die, you're either going to experience nothing or you're going to experience something. If it's nothing, then it doesn't matter what you believed in this life. If it's something, then it probably does matter what you believe in this life. So if you bet on nothing and you get nothing, you end up with nothing. But if you bet on nothing and you get something, it might not be so good for you. So you should bet on something. Pascal's wager. People say, oh, that's silly, that doesn't work, that's not what faith is. And I want to say, well, wait a second. Suppose that you were given a month to live. There was no known cure. But there's a pill. And the pill has a 50% chance. It's an experimental pill. 50% chance of curing you. Or a 50% chance of killing you. You know you're going to die in a month. This pill will either kill you or it will cure you 50-50. You can go either way. Who thinks it's senseless to even consider the possibility? Why not try it? It's an interesting question that humbles up, which is this: what if I'm wrong? What if I live for all this world has to offer and I bet on nothing, and what if I'm wrong? It's a humbling question. What if there really is a God who made me, loves me, died for me, and is searching diligently for me, and has nothing but good planned for me? And I don't pursue it. What if I'm wrong? When you stare at the Grand Canyon, you get this overwhelming awe. This is what it's like to stare into the face of the question of God. So it's worth asking, is there good reason to believe that God exists and that he's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him? And should I be telling the world about it? You'll hear people say the world is just getting less and less religious because we're learning more and more answers to the questions we only needed God to answer in the past. We used to think that God had to send the water down and pull the water up, but now we know the water cycle, so we don't need God. We used to think angels had to push the planets, but now we have the law of planetary motion, so we don't need God. And the truth is just the opposite. If you step out of the world as you know it, step out of the middle-class American system and take a look at the global picture, religion is skyrocketing. You know why? Because advancing technology, being able to do more in the last 50 years than we were able to do in the last 500, has only raised more questions and taught us more about the emptiness of our own devices. Religion's skyrocketing. People are continually asking hard questions for which there is no good answer in this life. C.S. Lewis once said, I find within myself that I'm thirsty, and what do you know? There's water. I find within myself that I'm hungry, and what do you know? There's food. And if I find within myself a longing for something transcendent, something more than what this earth provides, the answer is probably that I was made for another world. Do you sense that? Story after story after story comes to us of people who thought they had everything figured out until they realized they are spiritually barren. And then they reach the point where they sense their need for God. I heard about a music major who's listening to Mozart's Requiem. Mike, you'll like this one. Listening to Mozart's Requiem and gets near the end and realizes what makes this song so powerful is if you already know and appreciate the themes of death and resurrection and renewal, and thinks, what would this music be without that story? It convicts him. I hear a story about a surgeon who finds out he himself has stage 4 cancer. And he goes through all the process that he himself has helped other people go through. And as he goes through it, he realizes, this could just be the kind of thing where you put me down as a number and you treat me as a machine, and this is just all whatever. But the truth is, I have real emotional thoughts and needs and feelings and hurts and wants, and I long for something greater than just, does 1 + 1 = 2? And going through this makes me realize there's more to life than just physics can answer. So what do we do if we're going to go about trying to ask questions like, who is God? Does he exist? What does he want from me? There's a couple of ways you can go about it. The way I was taught growing up when I was much younger was that there's one and only one important question to ask. What is true? And I want you to know that 30 to 50 years ago, that was probably not just the question. It was probably the most important question, and it was the question on most people's minds. You remember that there was a time, and this is probably before 50 years ago, when if there was a gospel meeting going on, everybody in town would come to it, right? It was a different world, different culture. And I was reading a story that said that there was a Christian philosopher, an apologist who would go to college campuses and talk about why God exists. And he said, 30 years ago, the main questions I'd be asked from students were questions about truth. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Are there good reasons to believe in God? He said, but now by far, the majority of my questions are about Christianity's goodness. Is Christianity tolerant or intolerant? Are Christians the good guys or the bad guys in the history of the world? And said, I find that what people are longing for is more than knowing, is it true? What they're wanting to know is it good? And is it beautiful? Does it resonate with me? That doesn't mean it doesn't matter if it's true. It just means the first thing they want to know is it something that resonates with my desire for something that is good and beautiful? I want to go back to Pascal for a second. Years ago, we're talking a long time ago, he said, it might be interesting if you start by asking, is religion respectable? And then asking, is religion desirable? And then ask the question, is it true? Let me explain to you what that would look like. Go back deeper psychologically. If God is truth, beauty, and goodness, which is what I believe, then it should be the case that when I tell you the story of who God is and what he's done for us, if I tell it right, you should want it to be true, even before you come to the conclusion that it is true. And so I think there's fresh relevance for our culture if we try to approach the question that way. I think that, as Ortlund points out in his book, that we live in a time of disillusionment and disenchantment. There's always pockets in which things are different, but I'd say by far you will find a sense of gloominess. And if you think you have no spiritual need, then hearing someone come to you directly and say, here, listen, you have a need, and his name is Jesus, and there's a God, and if you don't obey, there might be bad things for you, that might strike them the way that maybe a corner street preacher might sound to you. But if there's some indirect conversation going on, we might be able to speak to somebody, even in a period of disillusionment and disenchantment, if we can tell a more enchanting story. Beauty works. There are people who have come to Christ through reading the Bible as they should. But there are people who come to Christ through reading about Narnia in Lewis's books. Or they come to Christ by reading The Lord of the Rings, and they say, this is a profound story. What if it was true? There's beauty in all of it. Somebody went up to Lewis one time and was very upset and said, you're writing these kids' books about Aslan the lion, and I know it looks a lot like Jesus, but what's going to happen if they fall in love with Aslan first? Won't they be disappointed? And he said, actually, that's exactly what I want them to do. I'm writing this so that you will fall in love with the story world, and then as you get older, you realize the story world is actually true. Do you realize that most of us live or die not for facts, but for the stories those facts represent? When somebody says that our military is willing to die for the flag, you know that that usually doesn't mean thread. It means what the flag represents. When the sheriff stops you in the name of the law, it's not because he's wearing a shiny badge, it's because of what the badge represents. We talk about the death of Christ. We're talking about the cross, but you remember there's at least 3 crosses on that hill. Remember the great line in Rocky? Where Rocky says, I see 3 of them. And what does Mick say? Hit the one in the middle. Yeah. There were at least 3 crosses that day, and it's the one in the middle that matters. And it's the story about that. It's not just the historical fact that a man named Jesus died 2,000 years ago. It's that we believe that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. There's a story that cross represents, and that's what we live and die for. So how do we tell the story in ways that are enchanting, that can draw people in so that they will say, I wish with all my heart that was true, because it's so beautiful and so good. And then all the facts we have that help us think about truth begin to do their work. Beauty helps us feel the stakes of what we're dealing with when it comes to life or death matters, with the deepest longings of our heart. We live in an age of disillusionment. We live in an age of distraction. We live in an age of outrage and polarization. And as we get more pluralistic, we also get more pessimistic. But beauty and goodness are places where you can start conversations that resonate with our hearts. They bring the conversation to some place other than wanting to always fight with each other. And so what I like to do is to try to find common ground first. There's a way of doing this where the first thing you do is you say, everything you believe is wrong, everything I believe is right. It's hard to get people to listen at that. But if it helps with, tell me what you've experienced to be true, and then let's ask some questions about it. And then we start trying to reason to the best explanation and say, why do you think that is? I find that good questions go a long way. It's called the cumulative case approach. That what we're trying to do are create invitation doors that will bring you into a greater story. Do you realize that secularism, naturalism, the idea that all there ever was or is or will be is nature, that's almost an exact quote from Carl Sagan, that all there ever was or is or will be is nature within the system. That itself is a story. Story that goes like this. You are a wonderful, mind-bogglingly wonderful accident that had no provision, no purpose, no inherent meaning. But you can find things in this life to give you what you might call purpose or meaning for as long as you live. But what's true for you is going to be different than what's true for someone else. And so this idea of inherent rights, truths, or values just depends on who barks the loudest. And this idea of caring about your neighbor over yourself seems foolish when all there is this life, and getting ahead makes the most sense because whoever dies with the most toys wins. This idea that there's sacred and there's secular is a fiction. It's all secular, unless you want to call something sacred. But what you value, what your value system is, may be different than someone else's value system, and there's no way you can tell somebody else what is right or what is wrong. And so it makes it very difficult to have anything like international laws or international rights. But don't worry. We've got really good food, really good music, and some really good drugs that will keep your mind occupied so you don't have to stand face to face with the question, what if I'm wrong? Secularism, naturalism offers no hope, no meaning, no purpose, no ultimate consolation. But I've got a different story. I've got a different story. You were made with meaning and purpose by an infinitely wise creator who is just as good as he is wise, who wanted you and gave you free will and watched you as you ran away and said, I'll do anything to get you back, even if it costs my own life or my own son. And wants to work with you and through you and in you and is planning for a day in which he will make all wrong things right. Because there's meaning and purpose and value in this world and in the life to come. There's power in stories. One historian said that there are many civilizations that have existed without the wheel, but there's no society that ever existed without stories. We live and die for stories. And so I want to explore the possibility with you over the next several weeks that the world had a beginning, that the world has meaning, that we experience conflict in need of resolution, and that there is real hope to get out of this mess. But I want to do it by trying to reason to the best explanation and asking, why is that? These will not be knockdown, drag-out arguments that says, if you don't believe what I'm telling you, you're a fool. It's not that. It's let's ask the hard questions and then ask, what are the two stories, and compare them on what we do with what's sitting in front of us. A good illustration Ortlund uses in his book is he says, imagine that you're living with a roommate and your roommate loves to eat Wendy's. Raise your hand if you actually do enjoy Wendy's. All right. Don't be afraid. Travis, what do you like to eat? What's that? Okay. So you come home one day and there's a half-drunk Frosty. Half eaten or half drunk? Is it food or is it drink? All right. Half a Frosty. And it's sitting there. And you're not living with anybody else and you don't remember any visitors coming in. It's a reasonable conclusion that that is your roommate. You know what? That's not a knockdown, drag-out, obvious proof. There could have been a visitor you're not aware of. I mean, this is silly, but there could be somebody living in your basement closet. It's been known to happen. But this is how this works as part of a larger cumulative case argument, asking little by little, what's in front of us, what makes the most sense, and which story makes sense of it that fits with everything else I've experienced in my life. And when we do that, we begin to see that secularism offers very little ultimate explanation, not just ultimate purpose. God is part of the complexity of our lived experience, and we begin to say, if there is no God, this question we're asking becomes a whole lot more complicated. So let me end with a note from one of Lewis's books, The Silver Chair. And there's a character called Puddlegum. And Puddlegum and his friends are held underground and tempted by an evil sorceress to doubt all that they believe is good about the world, the sun, the stars, Aslan himself, who represents Christ. And Puddlegum replies this way: "One word, ma'am, one word. All you've been saying is quite right. I shouldn't wonder. I'm a chap who always liked to know the worst and then put the best face I can on it. So I won't deny any of what you've said. But there's one thing more to be said, even so. Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things, trees and grass and sun and moon and stars and Aslan himself. Suppose we have. Then all I can say is that in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one. And that's a funny thing. When you come to think of it, we're just babies making up a game if you're right. But 4 babies playing a game can make a play world which licks your real world hollow. That's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any. Even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it. I'm going to live as if I'm a Narnian, even if there is no Narnia. So thanking you kindly for your supper, if these 2 gentlemen and the young lady are ready, we're leaving your court at once, and we're setting out into the dark to spend our lives looking for Overland. Not that our lives will be very long, I should think, but that's a small loss if the world's as dull a place as you say." You know what's going on there? They're not saying, I don't care if it's true as long as it's beautiful. What they're saying is, what you're offering me, what secularism and naturalism offer me, is so dull and boring and meaningless. I wouldn't want it even if it's true. And this counter story is telling me that it's so beautiful and so good, it makes me think that your story may not be true. That's the way I want to approach this. Let's pray. God, we love you. We praise your name. We ask you to give us a better understanding that the way you made us and the world you made for us is deeply good and beautiful, fitted for us. And Father, while there is evil and sin and death and decay, we know that those are foreigners and that one day all will be made right. Father, teach us to search our hearts, to test the spirits, to counter the stories, and to realize that what you do for us and what you've given us is so deeply good, so deeply beautiful, so profoundly true, that you are the answer to our deepest longings. In Jesus' name, amen.